wonder if the nutrition facts you've been told are actually true? I used to trust tons of common nutrition myths until going vegan opened my eyes to what's really accurate. Now, 5 years later, I'm in the best shape of my life and feeling better than I ever have. So in this video, I'm gonna debunk the 11 surprising nutrition myths I believe and show you how to take those learnings and completely transform the way you eat. So imagine you were roaming the desert and you run into this village of people. They all seem friendly enough, but once you start talking to them, you realize they all seem really concerned and anxious. So you ask one of them why, and they say, well, I'm just really worried we're not getting enough sunlight.
Huh?
You'd probably be really confused by that, right? Not enough sunlight. Well, that's the sort of relationship we have with protein nowadays. People today are really concerned about getting enough protein, almost obsessing over it. Experts say as long as you're eating enough food, you're already meeting or exceeding your daily protein goals. And in fact, focusing on protein means you're probably missing out on an extremely important nutrient nearly every American is deficient in, and I'll get into that one later. Now, how often have you heard the nutrition advice, you need to cut carbs to be healthy? This is something I used to believe too, until I realized it wasn't as black and white as I thought. And as it turns out, carbs can be good for you. Now hold on, before you call into Whole Foods and order 3 cakes, let me explain. Well, in the same way that there are good fats and bad fats, there are good carbs and bad carbs. So complex carbs, which are found in fruits, beans, whole grains like oats and whole wheat pasta, are really good for you. One study found that people who ate 70 grams of whole grains per day had a 23% lower risk of death from cardiovascular disease and a 20% lower risk of cancer death compared to those who ate few or no whole grains. So the reason most people feel better when they eat less carbs is usually because they stop eating a lot of the bad carbs. But pasta, potatoes, and beans can be health promoting options as long as you eat them in their whole food forms. And on that note, I used to be really confused about how weight gain worked, especially based on the way people talked about it. The information out there made it seem like some foods would go directly to your waistline. Just looking at them funny would make you gain weight. But that's really not the case. What it really comes down to is how many calories you eat versus how many calories you burn, and over a period of time. And if you're consistently eating fewer calories than you eat, you should go down in weight. The reason people say foods like white bread, Oreos, and cakes are gonna cause weight gain is because they have a ton of calories, but they don't make you feel full, which leads to overeating. Technically, you could lose weight eating only those foods as long as you burn more calories than you eat, but you'd be fighting hunger cravings all day. On the other hand, there are other foods that have the opposite effect by making you feel full. One study found that when people were instructed to eat 5 cups of beans and other legumes throughout the week, they lost as much weight as a group that was told to eat 500 fewer daily calories. This next myth kept me from looking into eating a more plant-based diet for a long time. Like a lot of people, I thought you could only get protein from animal products. So I was big on Greek yogurt, chicken, turkey, all the lean sources. I didn't really think about the plant foods that had protein like almonds, oats, quinoa, but what I really didn't understand was that all plant foods have some protein, even stuff you wouldn't expect like spinach, bread, and pasta. And that leads me to my next myth. I was always under the impression that even if plants did have protein, it was certainly not enough for someone like me, who loves going to the gym and playing sports. Especially in college, I remember reading about athlete protein requirements of 1 to 2 grams of protein per pound. Well, that all changed after I watched a documentary called The Game Changers, where lots of vegan athletes and bodybuilders were successful on plant-based diets. And I got curious and I thought, okay, what's the science say? It turns out, to maximize muscle gains, we only need 1.6 grams per kilogram or 0.7 grams per pound, which is extremely easy to hit on a vegan diet as long as you're making sure to get a few high-protein foods a day, like beans, lentils, and soy. Hold up.
Did you just say soy?
Yes. That leads us to the next myth. I remember as early as middle school, my friends and I were discussing protein powder, to get those middle school gains, and they said, make sure you don't get soy. That's bad for you. And I basically carried that with me for over 10 years. But when I went vegan, I started looking more into it because people kept recommending different soy products like tofu, tempeh, edamame, and soy milk. It turns out, soy is good for you, and consuming it several times a week and probably more often is likely to provide health benefits. And as I've gotten older, I've realized the fear of soy is something I've heard mostly in the US. In Mexico, for example, when I talk to people and say, well, you know how people say soy is bad for you? They look at me like, huh? There, soy is recognized for being a healthy nutrient powerhouse. Not to mention people in Eastern Asian countries have been eating soy for centuries. And you know what they haven't been having? Milk. All right, who remembers this?
Drink your milk, kids.
I don't want milk. Milk's for babies.
I happen to know that milk helps build strong bones, so drink up.
Well, Mr. Miller told me he never drinks milk. Look at him.
Oh, that's not good.
Got milk.
Growing up, in the same way that animal products meant protein, milk meant calcium. Full stop. And what's more, having strong bones meant drinking a lot of milk. But when I went vegan, I became aware of the research that suggested not only did milk not seem to help with bone strength, but it also had some other side effects that were a bit weird. On one hand, a meta-analysis of cow's milk intake and hip fracture studies showed no significant protection. But what's a bit more concerning is that a 2015 meta-analysis found that high intakes of dairy products, so milk, low-fat milk, and cheese, but not non-dairy sources of calcium, appear to increase total prostate cancer risk. And worst of all, people say it gives them acne.
Here we go.
But so if milk doesn't help with strong bones, what are the alternatives? How else could you get calcium? Sounds like we're ready for the next myth. So I used to think that dairy was the source of calcium. But in the same way I found out plants have protein, I found out that there are a ton of plant sources of calcium too. For example, plant milks like oat milk and almond milk are usually fortified with calcium, and they don't come with the health risks that dairy does. That being said, soy milk is the least processed of them all. It's full of protein, it's creamy, and has a great texture, so you'll always find me choosing that one. Plus, it's been linked to protecting hair loss in men. But other plant sources of calcium are many dark leafy greens, chia seeds, almonds, tahini, broccoli, oranges, etc. So I was sitting in Arabic class freshman year of college, Hala, and I remember my professor came in and goes, "I've been doing a gluten-free diet and alhamdulillah, I feel so much better." And that was the first time I think I ever heard of gluten. And since then, I've only heard it in a negative context. It seems like everyone's trying to avoid it these days. But is there any good reason to do that? Well, it ties in with the whole complex carbs versus simple carbs thing. Gluten is just a component of wheat, and it depends more on if you're eating the whole grain version or the more processed version. My professor is probably feeling better because she cut out a lot of simple carbs, processed carbs essentially. And like I mentioned earlier, eating whole grains, including whole wheat, is going to provide health benefits. So unless you have some sort of allergy or gluten sensitivity, it's really nothing to be afraid of. So you can put Italy back on your travel list. When I was growing up, my mom would always make sure to give me eggs for breakfast before I had an important presentation or exam, so I had the necessary fuel to get through the day. I mean, you couldn't ask for a healthier breakfast than eggs, right? But it turns out that even though eggs are a decent source of protein, about 60% of the calories in eggs are from fat, much of which is saturated fat. Eggs are also loaded with cholesterol, about 200 milligrams for an average size egg. That's more than double the amount in a Big Mac. And fat and cholesterol both contribute to heart disease. When it comes to breakfast, you have much better options that are also high in protein, like oats, a protein smoothie bowl, or even maybe making yourself a tofu scramble, which is very close to an egg experience. Plus, they have no cholesterol, they're low in saturated fat, and they all have a key nutrient that basically every American is deficient in. And that leads me to my next myth. I don't remember exactly when the protein hype train started, but I do remember that at some point growing up, high protein started getting pushed everywhere. And today people take for granted that getting protein should be your main dietary focus. And it's ironic because according to experts, as long as you're getting enough calories, you're getting enough protein. The sad part is there actually is a nutrient that the USDA has flagged a public health concern because people aren't consuming enough of it. Only 4% of people in the US get the minimum recommended value of this nutrient. And that nutrient is, of course, fiber. Consuming more dietary fiber may reduce risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and some types of cancer. And it's so simple to get enough if you know where to look. And if your first thought was, oh, fruits and vegetables. No. Out of the foods that have fiber, those are the worst foods for getting it. Legumes, whole grains, and to a lesser extent nuts and seeds should be where your mind goes to when you think of fiber. Like just one of these regular sized cans of beans has almost double the amount of fiber the average American gets in a day. But also, that's all you would need to be over your dietary fiber goals for the day. Not to mention, beans also have loads of protein, so they're gonna be one of the most important foods you should be eating. And it's not just beans. There's so many plant foods that pack loads of fiber, protein, and they're cheap. So to find out what those are, watch this next video.